I'm Warwick Sabin, Executive Director of the Society of Fellows, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this SOF digital discussion. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I want to thank you for being part of the Society of Fellows. Your membership directly supports and sustains the work of the Aspen Institute, and that support and that work is more critical now than ever before. And I want to acknowledge that we're coming together at a particularly challenging time for our nation. And therefore, we're very fortunate to have Richard Haass and Jane Harman in conversation with us today. Richard is in his 17th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And before that, he was director of policy planning for the US State Department. In addition to his extensive foreign policy and national security experience, Richard is the author or editor of 14 books. And today he will be discussing his latest work, The World, A Brief Introduction, which is already on the New York Times list of best-selling books. And as you know, Jane Harman is a trustee of the Aspen Institute and served 9 terms in the US House of Representatives, where she was a member of all the major security committees, Armed Services, Intelligence, and Homeland Security. Now she is the Director, President, and CEO of the Wilson Center. As with all of our SOS digital discussions, Richard and Jane will be glad to answer your questions after the initial conversation, and you can submit your questions anytime by simply clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing them in. And if you encounter any problems during the event, please email the SOF hotline and our team will be glad to assist you. So Richard and Jane are going to chat for the first 20 or 30 minutes, and then I will pose your questions to them for the rest of the event. Jane, thanks so much for being here, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Warwick. I hope you can hear me. I think I've pushed all the right buttons. Yay, me. Hello to my great friend Richard and many others listening in. I'm delighted to be part of this SOF conversation. I hosted one in my home in Washington, where I now am, with Nick Burns a few years ago, but I'm reminded that was in person and this is virtual. Our whole world, sadly, is so different from a few years ago. This is a very sobering time in Washington. I'm not sure how many are in Washington, but there's a 7 p.m. curfew. More people were tear gassed today. There was mayhem yesterday in Lafayette Square. And I just have to say, I've seen a lot during a reasonably long life. I saw the assassinations of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King in the 60s. I saw the protests against the Vietnam War. I saw 3 impeachments. I was actually in Congress for 2 of them, one as a staffer and one as a member. And yet what I'm seeing on my television is in some ways more horrifying. So I just have to express my opinion, and I'm delighted that we're talking with someone today who I sure will have his opinion about that and who has an extraordinary view of foreign policy. Oh, and I should have added, Richard, that I have been a card-carrying member. That means I pay my dues each year of CFR since 1992, the year I entered Congress. And I'm very proud to be a member and very proud to be a contributor to, from time to time, to Foreign Affairs Magazine, which I think is just a spectacular publication. Okay, so enough about me. Let's talk about Richard Haass. As you heard from Warwick, this is his 14th book, but only his 10th on foreign policy. I'm trying to write my first on security and intelligence policy, and it's really hard. This is 10. And though I would like to believe I already knew everything or know quite a bit about foreign policy, Richard's smart writing has given me plenty of new ideas to think about. So let's get right into this. So Richard, this is your 10th book, and yet this kind of winds back and explains international relations from the ground up. It has the unassuming title of The World. Explain why you wrote this book.
Why did I write this modestly titled book?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this. Thank you, and Aspen, for having me. This is a different kind of book for me. It's a book at a general audience, not, if you will, to people with your background necessarily, or members of the Council on Foreign Relations, though obviously I'd love them to read it. But it's a book for a general audience. And the reason I wrote it is that you can graduate from virtually any high school in this country, from any college or university in this country, and not have even a basic knowledge of the world that you're going to enter or that will affect your lives. You could be a religious watcher of the nightly news and again, not learn anything about the world. You can spend time on the internet, but again, not learn anything about the world. So what led me to write this book is I was struck by the disconnect. On one hand, in the global world in the 21st century, as we just learned painfully with COVID, what happens in Wuhan doesn't stay in Wuhan. As we learn from climate change all the time, as we learned the hard way on 9/11, nothing is very far anymore. Distance doesn't mean a lot. The world affects us. Yet I was struck by that reality and the fact that the understanding of most Americans about this world that will so shape their lives was so limited. And what I try to do was essentially try to narrow that gap by writing a book that would be accessible to experts and non-experts alike, to give them the basic history, understanding of the world's regions, understanding of globalization, and insight into how the world works.
Well, bravo. Very brave of you. You said that we will, through your book, understand the world. I can't resist, since I said this is a very sobering time. How do you think right now the world is understanding us as they see the protests on all our streets?
Jane, it's an important and truly sober question. Let's just take a step back. The protests are simply the latest. Think about it. The world has watched a largely inept American response to COVID-19. They see an economy that's reeling, 40 million unemployed, the world's most powerful economy on its heels. Even before this, the world had doubts about the United States, whether it was how prevalent guns are, opioid use and deaths, problems with our immigration policy, problems when you land in New York and you land at Kennedy Airport and you see, I'd call it a third world airport, except that probably does a disservice to parts of the third world. So I think this all happens in the context of the United States that isn't quite Ronald Reagan's shining city on a hill to a lot of people in the world. And this is a reminder, this graphic piece of footage about police brutality, about racism, and now then you've got also, the problem isn't the peaceful protests, that's wonderful, that's part of what makes America great, but there's the violence in the protests, the way that last night the president dispersed peaceful protesters so he could make a political point. I expect a lot of the world is shaking its head, saying this is not the United States we thought we knew, this is not the United States we respect. The fact that there are so many demonstrations around the world, particularly in Europe at American embassies, that tells you something. That to me tells you that we have disappointed the world, and more important, our ability to set an example that others want to follow is much diminished. We've also in some ways legitimized other leaders who want to send their police and military into the streets. We used to stand for the extension of democracy around the world. What happened?
Yeah. Well, let's pick up from there. The Ronald Reagan shining city on a hill. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I don't think it matters. Ronald Reagan offered hope. Barack Obama offered a different version of hope. I think a lot of our problem, I just wonder if you agree with this, is that people don't see that our country stands for hope anymore. It's not just core constitutional values. We could go through all those, and there are many reasons to believe that over many jurisdictions and many administrations, some of those have been somewhat disregarded. But would you agree with me that when people, the one word I think that described America more than any other word over time was hope, and that is really not something people have anymore about or feel anymore about our country?
I probably would have used a different word, which is very close to, which is opportunity. And the whole idea of the United States was we were founded on an idea that you weren't defined by what you were born into or by the color of your skin or how you prayed to God or what gender you are. No, but you were defined by opportunity. We all had equal opportunities. I know, before anyone reacts, that for decades, for centuries, we didn't live up to our own principles.
Yeah.
And what we've seen the last few days is we still don't live up to our own principles. There's still a gap between what we're meant to be, why we became an independent country, and and how we live. And one way to think about the challenge for all of us is, how do we narrow that gap? How do we make opportunity not simply aspirational, but real? How do we make the American dream not a real, but the American reality for everybody, regardless, among other things, the color of their skin? And what the events of the last few days show is still how far we have to go. We're not anywhere close to where we need to be.
So we could stay on this, but what does your book teach a reader? Let's imagine at the high school level or the beginning foreign policy level.
Sure.
About how to think about opportunity and how to think about America.
Look, what it teaches anyone at any level, whether you're a student, whether you're a 60-year-old going to vote this fall, and you have to think about who to vote for and why. It teaches you that the world is interconnected, that nothing stays local for long. Again, we just had a graphic demonstration of that. It shows that isolationism is a dead end. We can stick our heads in the sand till the cows come home. But like that ostrich, if I can mix my animal metaphors, will be washed away by the tide. It also shows that there's nothing in the world we can do better alone than we can do with others. One of the structural advantages of the United States is we have partners, we have allies, and indeed the last 70 or 75 years have been a remarkable era of history. One of the things I try to show, I teach a lot of history in the book, but the last 75 years, beginning with the end of World War II, have been in some ways the greatest stretch of human history. There's been no great power conflict. There have been other conflicts, I understand, but no great power conflict. The average lifespan has increased by decades. Wealth has increased astronomically around the world. Billions of people have been lifted out of poverty. And what this shows to me is the value of international involvement and American leadership. And I try to explain that. Now, again, you and I have had debates. Anyone listening to this, watching this, can have debates about this or that policy. But my point is simply that we do better when we're involved in the world, and we do better when we're acting with others. I don't think that can be argued.
Well, the backdrop of my Zoom here is the Wilson Center, which is in the Ronald Reagan building. The Wilson Center is a living memorial to Woodrow Wilson, who many would credit as being our first truly internationalist president. Not that his record was perfect, it wasn't, but he had the vision for the League of Nations, which he didn't achieve, which became the United Nations, and which spawned a lot of international organizations that we have that have connected our world. Lately, we've seen the US withdraw from a number of those things, like the WHO. I'm not sure technically that's accomplished, like the Paris Treaty Accord, like the proposed TPP, the trade agreement with Asian countries, et cetera, and like a number of arms control agreements. And I assume that that kind of withdrawal feeds this narrative that you're just talking about.
Yeah, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post the other day calling it the withdrawal doctrine. There's a pattern here where for 3 years we've been leaving. And look, in principle, intellectually, you could make the case sometimes that withdrawal might be warranted, but only if you're better off with the alternative. What I don't understand is when we simply leave the field and take our soccer ball with us, then they'll get another soccer ball. They play the game without us, and we lose influence. Our interests, we're not there to protect our own. We're not there to protect our own interests, and that I just don't understand. And we have a pattern of doing that. And again, the answer to flawed international arrangements, and every international arrangement is some way flawed, is better ones. You fix them, or you supplement them with new and better ones. And that's what we should be doing. And I would just simply say we're in an era of history. Here we are, Jane. We're about to start the third decade of the 21st century. And think about the big challenges: pandemics, obviously, terrorism, climate change, how to regulate cyberspace, proliferation. What do these have in common? They're all global challenges. We can't solve any of them by ourselves. We've got to work together with others. In virtually every one of these cases, there's some kind of a global framework that's wildly imperfect. It comes up short. It's in our interest to improve these frameworks, because otherwise we are vulnerable, as we've seen, we are vulnerable to the consequences. Jane, you're on mute.
I'm not. I am unmuted and unbowed. The soccer ball. I didn't mention China and Hong Kong, which is just yet another issue front and center. As I'm sure this audience all knows, China's recent announcement about the future governance of Hong Kong has not only got the folks in Hong Kong highly unsettled, but the entire world unsettled, and the Trump administration proposing that we change our relationship with Hong Kong. Many think that, to use the soccer ball, that China may be grabbing the soccer ball at a point of our weakness and restarting a new Cold War. I'm just putting it out here as a foreign policy, crucial foreign policy issue, restarting a new Cold War and picking up the reins that we have dropped in a number of international organizations. I mean, China thinks the WHO is worth supporting. Again, it's not perfect. China thinks that certain trading arrangements are not perfect but well supporting, and some kind of Asian infrastructure bank, other things are worth supporting, and maybe we don't. So what I'm asking you is, if we don't stay in the world that we helped build, the imperfect liberal world order, and we withdraw to the geographic boundaries of the United States, or maybe even a smaller patch, could China basically become, sadly, in my view, the superpower in the world, the soul, or certainly a power either equal to or eclipsing our power in the world?
I think in general, the alternative to a US-led world is a nobody-led world. I think China has certain limits to its power, certainly limits to its appeal, and what it's doing in Hong Kong, how it mishandled the virus will further limit its appeal. You see that in Asia, you see that in Europe. I think China also has a lot of internal weaknesses, demographic challenges, obviously political challenges, environmental challenges. The economy is slowed dramatically. So again, I'm not so much worried about what China does. I'm more worried about how the world unravels without the United States, which I think would be the most likely outcome. Now, look, I also worry about a U.S.-Chinese Cold War. This is the most important relationship of this era of history. And if we're in a Cold War with China, that's dangerous, it's expensive, it's distracting. And it means, for example, we won't be able to work together, say, on the North Korean nuclear and missile problem. We won't be able to work together on climate change. We won't be able to work together on pandemics. We won't be able to carry out those aspects of trade that are mutually beneficial. So I want to, if possible, avoid a Cold War. I actually want to enlist China to work on some of these global issues. I think that's the diplomatic challenge, and that'll take good old-fashioned state diplomacy, foreign policy, consultations, negotiations, the kind of meat and taters of what American diplomats were bred to do.
Well, you and I are, as we say at the Wilson Center, in violent agreement on this stuff, but I'm trying to find some edges where maybe we won't agree. China, you don't think that, you said the alternative to a US-led world is a nobody leads world. Really? I mean, if we continue to decline, if our cities become, this chaos doesn't end, our election doesn't conclude, I'm just thinking of a parade of horribles. We are vulnerable to asymmetric terror attacks. North Korea is resurgent. You mentioned North Korea. It is testing both delivery systems and nuclear weapons. And let's just imagine China is not our ally against a resurgent North Korea because cooperation is broken down. Are you sure there wouldn't be a China-led world?
I don't think there would be. I don't think Japan would stand for it. I don't think India would stand for it. The Europeans would push back. China, again, doesn't have a model that most others want to emulate. I also think China has its own real domestic challenges in terms of political continuity. The environmental degradation is profound. The one-child policy has all sorts of bad long-term demographic repercussions. No, the problem is the North Koreans will do what they'll do. The Iranians will do what they're doing. The Islamic State or Al Qaeda will come back and do some of what they do. Climate change will be much worse because it hasn't been a priority for China. That's what worries me, that the world overall will continue to deteriorate, and we'll all pay an enormous we'll all pay an enormous price for it.
What about my thought that we're ripe for an asymmetric attack in the United States? I think our intelligence community now believes that the shooting of American soldiers on a military base in Tampa that was training Saudi workers was Al Qaeda inspired, the fellow who did it. And that sadly our vetting, which should have been a heck of a lot better, didn't catch this guy. But there's one example. Hezbollah has done things in the Western Hemisphere. That's an Iranian proxy in Argentina. Getting inspired on the web by Russian bots or pick a source ain't that hard. So what do you think about that? And where would we, and where are we with that, given, again, all of our brain cells,
Sure.
many of them focused on our burning cities?
Well, look, I've long compared, funnily enough, terrorism to pandemics in the sense that they're both viruses and neither one can be completely eliminated. There'll always be terrorists, there'll always be people willing to die and kill for their political cause. And this year it's COVID-19. This time it's COVID-19. We'll have COVID-23, or we'll have some bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. So I just assume, as a modern society and inevitably open to some extent, that we will face these challenges. Borders are not impermeable. Oceans are not moats. Sovereignty is not an absolute defense. We can proclaim it till the cows come home, but we're still to some extent vulnerable. So invulnerability is not, to me, a realistic goal. You want to reduce vulnerability. Above all, you want to increase resiliency, your ability to absorb these attacks if and when they happen. But ultimately, I mean, also though, as you've worked on in your career, you want intelligence to be strong so you can stop the attacks before they happen. We can build defenses, but as we've again learned with both 9/11 and COVID-19, we have to build resiliency into our society. Terrorism, like, there'll never be the battleship Missouri. For those who didn't study the history, this was the surrender ceremony for World War II. There will never be a battleship Missouri ceremony with terrorism, any more than there'll be the equivalent with COVID-19. These are now, in some ways, open-ended struggles that we have to build our societies to cope with.
I have a theory about terrorism, which is that the way we defeat, or at least reduce, the threat of terrorism is to win the argument with those who attack us because they think we're evil. I think that's the better strategy than over-militarizing our response, which we've done for years. But I'll leave that there because I do want to go to one other topic, to the place I spent 17 years as a member and 5 years as a staffer. That's even longer than you've been at CFR all in. And that is called the United States Congress, or AKA the incredibly shrinking United States Congress. You have studied history. Checks and balances and our Constitution make the Congress the Article I branch of government. And in history, in my recollection, I have never seen Congress this weak, this feckless, this unable even to authorize or deauthorize the use of military force in various war theaters where we are. And right now, given this issue, there are no signs of Congress, certainly no signs of one of the parties in Congress. What are your observations about the role of Congress and whether it could play a constructive role at this point?
Well, the Constitution is actually relatively sparse when it comes to talking about the foreign policy powers. There is a certain bias, though, towards the presidency. And over history, the presidency, the executive branch, has become the preeminent branch when it comes to foreign policy. But now the imperial presidency has reached a pretty extreme position. I think Congress has made a mistake over the years by delegating all sorts of authorities to the executive branch. There's over 100 authorities that the executive branch now, in and of itself, can decide whether and how they ought to be exercised. Congress ought to pull those back. It ought to be using the hearing power wherever it can. It uses, when it can, the power of the purse to say make sure that we're funding foreign aid and other national security tools adequately. But I'm not going to sit here and argue your basic point that I think the intended balance, which it doesn't have to be 50-50, but the intended balance between the executive branch and Congress when it comes to national security policy is, to put it bluntly, the balance is out of balance.
Congress writes the checks, and Congress funds our whole menu of soft power, to use Joe Nye's wonderful phrase, not just our hard power. And soft power is basically what foreign policy is built on. And if we're defunding the State Department, we're defunding AID, we're collapsing a number of agencies, we're eliminating functions in the White House, what tools do we have to do good foreign policy?
Yeah, well, my good friend Bob Gates, there's a piece today online in Foreign Affairs. It's coming out in the new magazine based on his new book. And he basically argues that we've over-militarized foreign policy. So what's happening is we're asking too much too often of the military tool. So we're wearing it out. We're often asking it to do things it was never designed to do. And I think we're underusing other tools. And people forget that national security includes diplomacy, public, private, consultation, negotiation. It includes intelligence. So it's not limited to the military. So look, I would think that one of the real challenges for the next administration and to the new Secretary of State would be, among other things, to revive the Foreign Service. It's been decimated, and we need to once again attract the best and brightest. We probably need to bring back some people who retired early. We need to make lateral entries possible. We ought to start funding training along people's careers the same way the military does. We've got to start seeing people in the Foreign Service and in general the civilians involved in American national security every bit as important as the military.
In history, and I think we're about to go to questions, but in history, we have seen a lash up between the State Department and the Defense Department. It's kind of a yin-yang deal, with the military force being the last resort. I mean, obviously, I think it was Winston Churchill who said, jaw, jaw, not war, war. And I think jaw, jaw is what you're talking about. And I don't know how you jaw, jaw if there's no one there. And so, I think we're agreeing. I think there needs to be a roadmap for whatever administration comes next, including this one, on how to restore our foreign policy prowess, which is desperately missing. And I'd say again about Congress. Congress has had great leaders in the past on foreign policy. And you can think of the architects, I won't name the names, but I'm saying the Congress's voice is missing here. And yes, there has been a huge growth in executive power. This unitary executive theory didn't start with this administration. You can't even, I would say that the giant expansion happened on Bush 43's watch, right after 9/11. And when we basically militarized our response, looking back on that, I was part of that history. I think we made some mistakes. I think the war on terror, calling what we did the war on terror, over-militarized what we should have done, and that having a lot of soft power then might have won the argument with a lot of folks and confined the problem, maybe. But I'm just making the point that we have shortchanged ourselves, and I think you agree. Let me just ask last question on COVID, because we've all mentioned it, and it is a pandemic, world-demic. And it did start in China. There's still some argument about why. I don't see any hard evidence anywhere that it was a man-made virus deliberately sprung on people in Wuhan and then from them exported anywhere. So I don't think that theory is good. But I also think, from what I've read and know, that China was not not fully open with us. And the intelligence agencies in the US were on this earlier than we responded. So Richard, you have just become the foreign policy, the head of the State Department in the United States, and we're facing this enormous pandemic of COVID. What tools would you use now that we are not using?
Well, at this point, this COVID has happened. Now we're into, on one level, national responses in terms of distancing, masking, testing, a lot of the things we haven't done terribly well on in this country. There is a big place for international cooperation, though, in a couple of areas at this point. One is on economics, to help a lot of countries around the world that are going to be overwhelmed by this economically. A lot of them came into the pandemic already in debt trouble. They risk being overwhelmed, and a lot of weak states could become failed states. And we learned what happened when states failed, not just on a humanitarian level, but in terms of terrorism or tyranny. So I think there's that. There's also going to need to be global preparations for sharing and funding of antivirals and of vaccines, if and when any ever emerge. It's just not going to get done automatically. We've got to think about that. We've also got to think about how we improve the global public health machinery. How do we improve the World Health Organization? How do we improve the public health capacity of more than 100 countries that don't have what they need, their equivalent of the Centers for Disease Control? China's a different problem. China has the capacity. It chose not to use it. It didn't meet its international obligations, and that's a bigger problem. And it's easy in there. I think essentially one has to get into shaming and talking about it publicly and discrediting it. And also, we ourselves, despite everything China failed to do and what the World Health Organization failed to do early on, we failed to do things too. We obviously were not ready on testing. We weren't ready on equipment and all that. So we need to learn, we need to get ready next time, because there will be a next time. I think one of the important lessons of this, Jane, is this is not a one-off. This is not a black swan. This is what it's like to live in a global world. And whether it's climate or cyber attacks or terrorist attacks or virus attacks from a pandemic, this is what it's like. And we have got to get smarter about predicting them, stopping them, protecting ourselves, and recovering from them.
This is not our first rodeo, as you would say. I mean, we've
Absolutely.
had pandemics before. The Bush administration, Bush 43, spent some real time doing pandemic preparedness.
Absolutely.
And that's 2 administrations ago. I'm not positive that all that material was nurtured by the last administration, and it surely was not nurtured by this administration. If we're pulling out of the WHO and we missed the meeting a week or 2 ago about how to share, at least as I understand it, how to share some form of antivirals and other medicines we're developing here. I'm pretty pessimistic that we're going to play the role we need to play, not just in the world, where of course I agree with you that an obligation we have, and it is consistent with our history, is to help countries around the world. It's in our national interest to do that, oh, by the way, because we get their respect and support. But in addition to that, we'll fail domestically if we build walls around the preparedness efforts of others in the world, and they won't reach us. I don't know that we can fight a pandemic with one hand or maybe 1.5 hands behind our back.
Again, there aren't unilateral solutions to global challenges. And again, this is a learning experience. It's a painful one. We've lost 100,000 lives or more. We've got 40 million unemployed. This is a painful learning experience, but it would be even more painful if we didn't learn from it. And part of what the learning has to be is the world matters. We are not invulnerable. We're not disconnected. And we've got to be prepared for it. We've got to lead it.
Richard, I want to say we're going to questions now, but I think you have performed a great service by writing a how-to book that hits exactly now when most people now are practicing how not to. And wouldn't it be great if our kids, grandkids, etc., learn from your book and are better leaders than we were? I despair that we may leave them a worse world than we inherited, and that's our fault.
Well, hopefully a few of them are. As you'll see this Sunday in your New York Times, it's some people are buying it and reading it, so it's off to a good start.
Reading it because you're ranked on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's great. I think you need the fame. I mean, I was starting to worry that your star might be eclipsed. Just kidding.
I will try to overcome my shyness and modesty.
Yes, well, that's good. Well, anyway, I'm not canceling my membership to CFR. I'm proud to be there. I'm certainly not canceling my membership to Aspen. Also proud to be there. That picture you put up, folks, in my red leather jacket is at an event at Aspen. And that sure was a better time. Anyway, I think we're ready for questions, and I think Warwick is going to monitor that.
Absolutely, Jane. Thank you so much. That was a very, very impressive coverage of so many issues in 30 minutes. And so with that in mind, we have a lot of questions from our members, and they cover everything from the Middle East to China and that. But I want to start with a more generalized question. Our member Dan Peck in New York says that the current issue of Foreign Affairs magazine includes an article by Daniel Dresner, Ronald Krebs, and Randall Schweller that argues that the era of viewing international relations through a lens of grand strategy is over, and that moving forward, foreign policy should be conducted on a more opportunistic, ad hoc basis. What's your reaction to that position? Can grand strategy still serve a productive role for U.S. foreign policy under leaders capable enough to execute it, or is it time to bury it, as the authors suggest?
Well, I'm a great believer in comprehensive, consistent responses if they make sense. And I would say going forward, if I were designing U.S. foreign policy now, I would say the principal preoccupation of the United States and the world ought to be global arrangements. I think we've entered a period of history where global challenges like climate, pandemics, proliferation, terrorism, cyber are the principal challenges we face. Now, before anyone jumps down my throat, they are not the only challenges we face. We still face the traditional agenda, rising China, a difficult, shall we say, to say the least, Russia, and so forth. So we have the old agenda, but I think what's unique about this era of history is these global challenges. And I would argue, yes, I think there is a place for, if you want to call it, grand strategy in designing a foreign policy around that in terms of thinking about institutional arrangements. And I think, say one other thing, grand strategy is not only good in terms of, it's good for planning. You have to sometimes make long-term decisions, investments. It's also good for working with allies. It's also good for educating the American public. If you can basically go to the American people and say, here's where we are, and for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, this is what really matters. And that's why I'm asking you to support this. That's why we're spending your precious tax dollars on that. I actually think that ability to explain is essential if we're going to have the kind of consistent foreign policy we need to have. So I haven't given up on that sort of a long-term comprehensive foreign policy.
Excellent. And Jane, you'll have to unmute.
Could I add one thing to that? And that is that we've ever had this, dispute about, do we need realists or idealists? We need both. But what we don't have at the moment is any strategy. We have tactics, and the tactics are all short-term to guarantee somebody's election to this or somebody's poll numbers to that. And that's not foreign policy. And so everybody needs to read Richard's book to learn how to make foreign policy.
Thank you, Jen.
Excellent. Moving to the next question, our member Wendell Wilkie is asking you, Richard. You've made the case for maintaining a constructive relationship with China, given the growing significance of transnational issues where we must cooperate, such as the pandemic, terrorism, and climate change. But an intense anger is growing at the Chinese, exacerbated by election year politics, no doubt, because of their handling of the virus and other factors, including their increasing repression at home and aggressiveness abroad. Assuming an increasingly adversarial relationship, how can this be managed most effectively to advance our ideals and interests?
Well, I want to thank Wendell for asking the question. Full disclosure, Wendell and I met 47 years ago on a boat going over to, I think it was France, when we were both just graduated college off to Oxford for a couple of years. So I thought I should put that out there. Look, there are lots of things that China does that should give us real heartburn. I understand that. What is it going to take to work out a relationship that avoids a Cold War? It's going to take both sides, first of all. It takes two to tango. I would tell the next National Security Advisor or Secretary of State to make this his or her priority, to spend a lot of time talking with the Chinese about the rules of the road, what we think regionally and globally. Even more important, I'd say, let's get together with our allies. The structural advantage of American foreign policy during the Cold War vis-a-vis Russia is we had voluntary allies. Russia had imposed satellites. We had voluntary allies in Asia and in Europe. With China, we also have all sorts of partners and allies in Europe and Asia. What do? We walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What do? We beat up regularly on South Korea and Japan over the levels they spend on their defense, even though they're spending more than they used to. That makes no sense to me. So yes, I would talk to the Chinese, but even more important, I would come up with a common front to working with China and say, okay, it's not just us. We represent what, 20, 25% of the global economy, but we've now joined with these other countries. We now represent 50% of the global economy. So here's going to be the rules. You want access to our markets, here's what it's going to take. So I think we basically ought to make it a multilateral enterprise. You know, will China do certain things? No, but we can then make them pay a price for it. We can also raise the cost of their acting badly in other places, whether it's with sanctions or with greater defense preparations. But the key to this is going to be working with our partners and allies, at the same time having a serious conversation with the Chinese themselves, less in public, a little bit more in private.
Great. We have a very, very simple, easy question from Miles Krieger in Florida.
Oh, sure.
He says, in a shifting world, the Middle East dynamics have altered where Israel and the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia have become convenient partners, and the president favors defensible borders with regional financial help to the Palestinians to build a modern nation. What Israel-Palestinian solution do you favor?
Well, I guess I would disagree with the premises of just about everything in that question. I think the possibility of normalization between Israel and the Sunni Arab states is dramatically exaggerated. I think there's limits to what they will do without progress on the Palestinian front. I think what's going on now is there's no possibility of a two-state solution, given divisions on the Palestinian side between Hamas and Gaza and the authority in the West Bank. I don't think what Israel with this administration are putting on the table would be acceptable to any Palestinian leadership. And what worries me is not only will there not be a two-state solution, but we seem to be moving down the path of annexation. And I think two things could come of that. One could be real destabilization of Jordan and the Israeli-Jordanian relationship, which has been one of the cornerstones of Middle East peace. The other would be Israel, to me, what's so important about it, what's so wonderful about it, and what I think Americans need to support is Israel as what? A Jewish, democratic, secure, and prosperous country. And what worries me about the path it's going down is it's going to force itself to choose. And in particular, I don't believe Israel can be both democratic and Jewish on the path it's going down, because the two-state solution is dying. And if you end up with a de facto one state or one state plus outcome, Israel will either be Jewish or it will be democratic, but it cannot be both. And I think that would be a tragic outcome.
Jane, you had something to add, I think? You'll have to unmute.
I totally agree with that. I would add, though, that one of the things Israel has counted on for her, however many years it is since 1948 of existence, I guess I need better counting skills, is bipartisan, rock-solid support from the United States. And that is fracturing over this new policy of unilateral annexation. And I think that is a tragedy in the United States, but it will be a huge tragedy for Israel and Israel's future security. And I agree with every other thing that Richard said.
Let me ask both of you real quick. Technically, we're supposed to end the event now. Would you be willing to go just a few minutes longer to get to a couple more questions?
Yes.
Okay, those of you who have to go, we understand, but those of you who can stay, I just want to make sure we hit some of these issues. Scott Mariner asks, how do you view the threat of disinformation both from a foreign actor, self-induced perspective, to our ability to understand the world, govern effectively, and conduct foreign relations?
Look, I take foreign disinformation seriously. The Russians are obviously, they never stop doing it. and there may now be elements from other places, possibly China, possibly North Korea, possibly Iran. There's things we ought to do in terms of how we manage social media and all that. I worry about efforts to delegitimize or otherwise interfere in our elections. So that, I think, think about responses falling into a couple of categories. One are things we do to protect and manage elections, social media, and all that. Two is what we do to push back against foreign governments so they're less tempted to do this with sanctions or perhaps cyber efforts of our own. The third, though, is also the education of the American public. And I think we're less vulnerable to being manipulated if Americans are better educated. Conspiracy theories tend to thrive amongst people who don't have basic information. So again, I would love to have an America where courses about the world and also courses about American democracy, about civics, were required in high schools and colleges as a condition of getting a degree, where the news actually covered the news. So I would like to move to a place where the population was better educated, and then whether it was foreigners or anyone else who tried to manipulate them, they would be in a better position to recognize it for what it is and to dismiss it.
Jane, go ahead.
Well, I think that was a softball question to give us each a chance to pitch why think tanks and foreign policy tanks and the Aspen Institute and Wilson Center are so important. And at a time when all the news is spun and disinformation is everywhere, there has to be somebody who can assemble information and put on balanced programming reflecting different points of view so that people can make informed decisions. Having said that, we know that Russia interfered with the 2016 election. And Richard mentioned this one coming up. And I'll say it here, Russia and probably other countries and rogue actors are already interfering in our 2020 election. And we're gonna have to spend a lot of time making sure not just that information people get is as accurate as possible so they can make informed decisions, but also that voting is protected. And I can imagine somebody out there after the election in November saying it was rigged, it was a hoax, so on and so forth, and the results are false, and then having chaos here.
Indeed. In the interest of time, I'm going to combine two questions that are not perfectly related, but they're close enough. First one is, what are the repercussions of the U.S. pulling out of / defunding the World Health Organization in cooperation for the global pandemic? Second question is, you describe Trump's foreign policy doctrine as the withdrawal doctrine, unilaterally leaving TPP, WHO, Open Skies Treaty, Paris Climate Accord, the INF, and UNESCO. What opportunities are we creating for China to gain standing? So WHO first, and then sort of this greater question on unilateral withdrawal.
I think the impact of U.S. withdrawal from the WHO and defunding of it, it hurts a little bit the ability of countries that are dependent upon its funding to deal with the current pandemic. Its bigger impact is on the next one, quite honestly, and it's on other diseases. The WHO is not just in the business of dealing with COVID. It deals with a host of health challenges across the board. Indeed, I actually I have a chapter on in the book, and I think it would be wiser to somewhat change its priorities. That's another conversation. But the bottom line is, it has made contributions to a wide range of health challenges. And so the bigger problem might be the impact on other diseases and on the ability to contend with future viral or bacteriological outbreaks. Will China get something of a free ride? Sure. And if we're there, we're in a better position. I mean, let me just give you an example. Imagine instead of sending the letter he sent, the president had called a meeting of America's natural allies and partners in Asia, Europe, where have it, and said, we got a problem with the WHO. Here's what it is. Let's talk about an agenda for reform of the WHO, so to make it more effective and to make it more difficult for China or anyone else to get away with what China did this time. That seems to me that would have been a much wiser policy. And by the way, a tougher one on China. Now, essentially, China gets to play in the field without us pushing back.
Jane, did you have something to add?
Also, that our withdrawal from the WHO pulls most of its funding. And I know it's been a big deal to this administration to have burden sharing and all that. But if the WHO ceases to exist, given the flaws in the way it's managed itself, given a lot of things, Richard's right that one of the things we should be doing is making international institutions work better. But if we have no WTO, a WHO, and oh, by the way, we may not have a WTO either, then what? How do we manage the next pandemic at all and or predict it? Let's start with that. And on the WTO, we haven't talked much about the economic meltdown. Richard mentioned it, but it's happening in this country too. If we pull out of all of these trade agreements and international organizations and we blow up the G7, which may be happening under our eyes, then what? I mean, where are we left in terms of trying to put 40 million people back to work and restart our economy?
Thank you. I think that we've definitely gone about as far as we can go. I want to apologize for the folks who didn't get their questions answered, but I want to thank both you, Richard and Jane, for taking this time, certainly during a very pivotal moment in our nation's history and global affairs, to share your perspectives, to give us insight. We could probably talk about all of these issues for hours on end, but certainly we hope everyone will go get Richard's book if they haven't already. And continue to be involved in these kinds of discussions, both at the Aspen Institute, the Wilson Center, the Council on Foreign Relations, and all of the other organizations that we're all involved with. So again, Richard and Jane, thank you so much for being
Thank you, Art.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jane.
And I want to thank our members also for being with us today, and thanks for hanging out for a few extra minutes. We'll be back with you exactly a week from now, Tuesday, June 9th. For another terrific program. We're going to have Melissa Murray in conversation with Professor Stephen Carter, and we'll be sending you an invitation and more information about that tomorrow. So until then, stay safe, be well, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.